My name is Julia. I'll be talking to you about the differences between writing voiced and non-voiced dialogue. Um, it's been a crazy period. I know that some of the speakers have already touched upon that. The fact that we have a pandemic, the fact that we have dictatorial rulers everywhere, and institutional racism that is being dealt with at the moment has made this a NarraScope to remember, I think, and a life in a world in a year to remember. Like most of us, I have also been thinking about how what I do relates to everything that's happening and how relevant what I'm about to tell you is. How relevant everything that we do is, basically. And I guess that in the end, arts and culture are really important to make sure that a lot of stories are heard, that different stories are heard, that different and diverse voices are heard. So I'm hoping that in doing this talk, I can help you with thinking about how to have those diverse voices in your games and how to let them be heard, whether in audio or in writing. Yeah, so that's for my introduction. Doing this live, probably gonna ramble on a bit every now and then. But I'm enjoying doing this live because hopefully we can do this as interactive as possible. So if you're listening to this right at this moment and you have questions, please ask them while I'm talking, because then I can react to them already and make this an even more interesting talk. Obviously, I'll be here after the talk as well to discuss some more in the Discord Q&A channel of NarraScope. I can't see Twitch. You're all watching on Twitch. I can't see it. So please, if you have questions during my talk or after, put them in the Discord Q&A channel. That's my handle down there. If you add me during my talk, I will probably see it pop up so I can hopefully directly answer your question. Okay, so this is who I am. I went to theater school. I majored in writing for performance. And after that, I wrote for theater, obviously, for film, for TV, for radio as well. I went into theater directing. I did some pervasive theater gaming, hybrid sort of things, and then made my way into games and also digital games. Some of my work over the last couple of years has been Old Frequencies last year, which was a audio-only game. So that's definitely something I'll be talking a bit more about. I did the Criminal Minds mobile game. That one was non-voiced, but interesting as well because it's based on a TV series and we know what the TV actors sound like. So it's sort of a hybrid for me in writing. And another title, big title I wrote was Hearts, Medicine, Doctor's Oath, mobile game that is unvoiced but has a dialogue in text balloons in there, and we'll see a bit of that later on as well. So that's my background, and obviously that's the reason why I'm talking about voiced versus non-voiced, coming from theater and film being used to working with actors, then going into mobile gaming at first, where I had no actors. I had to learn quite a lot. Then I went back to working with actors again in games, and I could use all of those experiences. So I'm hoping to relay that to you. So this is what we're gonna talk about. Basically, if you're thinking about games with voice dialogue and games non-voiced, I like to think of it as a film versus comic book. So basically, if you have voice dialogue, you can think about the way you would write for movies or TV. If you don't have voice dialogue, I like to think about it like a comic book. comic books have really helped me in understanding how to write for games without actors. Even if your non-voiced characters move around, so if they're animated or whatever, obviously that has a plus compared to comic books. But still, to me at least, those comic book rules apply. Get back to that later. Image, by the way, that you see there is a page from the awesome Farmhand, a comic by Rob Guillory. Go and read it if you're interested in comic books and comedy in writing, because it's great. So what we'll discuss: characterization, jokes and irony, pacing, tutorials, a bit about working with actors. There was a great talk about voiceover acting and things like that a couple of days ago. If you haven't seen that, go look it up, because that was really nice. We'll talk a bit at the end about voice and written text, like if you have subtitles, things like that, and with some extra tips and tricks. Okay, so let's start with characterization. This is basically the biggest subject, I think, but we'll take it in steps. There are big differences in how you can characterize the way somebody speaks, the way a character speaks, when you have a voice or you have written dialogue. So basically, first thing that's different, obviously, is the sound. If you have an actor, you have the sound of an actor. I'm not talking about like dialects and stuff like that. We'll get to that later. But just, does somebody have like a deep voice or a high voice? Things like that. They tell you so much about a character already. And that's something that you don't have, obviously, in written words. So you have to think about stuff to replace that. You have speech patterns. So that's additional to the sound, the way that an actor will speak. That's both the actor and also the way you write it, because you can write speech patterns more easily if you know they're going to be voiced. And obviously you have vocabulary. Well, that's one thing that you also have in the written language. Vocabulary is obviously an important thing. What you can also do in the written language, if you don't have actors who voice your dialogue, you can use, for instance, recurring words. So, for instance, the fact that I said, for instance, twice now, that means that says something probably about me. You can use things like that to characterize your characters quite easily. Sentence length is another one. I see often that, especially people who start writing dialogues, often make every sentence of every character that they write exactly the same length. That's just because you go to your own speech pattern first. If you have actors who speak your sentences, that might be less of a problem, because sometimes they'll speak faster, speak slower, whatever. If it's just written down, you see the actual sentence length, and the length, and also the order, the word order. For instance, verb orders are often the same because that's the way you speak. They will be much easier to spot, and they will also be more annoying to the players. Don't forget that visualization of a sentence is something that really stands out. So even subconsciously, if you have like a character that speaks in really short sentences, you will see that immediately and you will remember that as a player. So that's something that you can really work on. Obviously, don't go overboard. Some things are hard or annoying to read. So if you have someone who has like recurring words or a specific speech pattern, it can be really annoying to read that all of the time. Some words are hard to read, even worse in gaming sometimes, because not everybody has the same reading speed. As a tip, there's guidelines for subtitling. Even if you don't do subtitling, because obviously they have to condense a lot of words that are spoken. But those guidelines are really interesting to read. You can look them up online. There's obviously different subtitle guidelines, but look for, like, for instance, the Netflix guidelines. You can definitely find them online, because they give you an insight as to what people find pleasing or annoying to read. And that can really help you when you're writing dialogue. Obviously, recognizable words, recognizable sentences are always, both in voice and in written dialogue, interesting. I have an image of Penelope Garcia from Criminal Minds. When I wrote the Criminal Minds game, it was quite easy to write for her, because she has such a specific way of speaking and a specific way of saying some things, that I could always hear her in my head. And it was really easy for me to write for her, because she was already an established character, and I really knew what she sounded like. And that can really help you if you think about things like that when you're writing as well. What can also help, here's some questions that might make sense for you. Like, does my character talk fast or slow? Does the character use big or small words? Like, is it somebody with really big vocabulary or not? Does my character ask questions often? Some people do that. They speak more in questions than in regular sentences. Examples, comparisons is also something. Some people really like to use examples in every sentence or comparisons. Do they talk apologetic or strong-headed? Do they exaggerate a lot? These are all questions that can help you define the grammar, the speech pattern, the special things in the way your characters are speaking. And they can really help you make a distinction between your characters. And this is especially, in my opinion, important when you're writing non-voiced dialogue, because when you're writing for voice dialogue, a lot of the characteristics will be in there because the actor has a specific sound. And you have to fill in a bit more to make characters really stand out if you don't have an actor. Next to this, listen. That's quite easy. Listen to people. Just go and listen to your friends, listen to your family, listen to random people in the store. If you're really looking for speech patterns and things like that, you will definitely find some things that you might not have noticed before. And that can really help you in making distinctive characters. So that's basically the first tip I can give you that is really useful. What I didn't mention yet was accents and dialects. Now I'm using those two words in a specific way. There's a lot of different ways you can talk about dialect or accent and which is which. Just for this discussion, I'll say dialect. In this case, I mean a specific dialect that has to do with, for instance, a city where somebody lives or an area, and that actually might have specific words or specific ways of writing down. By accents in this example, I mean the sound that people make when they're from a specific area or country. Um, if you're writing dialogue and you don't have an actor, you have the dialect, you can use that. Again, be careful, not everything is easy to read. So make sure it's still readable, but that can really help, obviously. When you have actors, you also have accents, and that can be incredibly useful. But there's a lot of, well, I call it mocking, stereotyping, and guesstimating going on. Let's say a lot of easy conventions that are used, like, we have a character from New York and we know exactly how people from New York talk, so we'll just have him talk like that, really exaggerated New York accent, things like that. And you can have that with cultural differences. You can have that with language differences. Yeah, it's easy, because if you do that, that means that people will really immediately understand an accent, or understand, oh, this person is from there and there. But it often goes into stereotyping areas, which I find a shame. Not just because it can turn into mocking, but also because I think you can be a lot more clever than that. Guesstimating, with guesstimating, I mean that you think you know what some accent is about, and you just use it like that. I'm from the Netherlands. Obviously, I'm not native English language. I have seen so much TV series, movies, whatever, that sort of guess how Dutch people sound, and usually will sound exactly like German people or people from Denmark or whatever. All of those things together. And it's not that hard, especially nowadays, to just start Googling and researching how people actually sound, and using that. And that's why I mention here, be creative, don't just copy conventions, because that's what often happens. You copy something that you've seen in movies over and over and over again. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's correct, or that that's what's useful for you. So if you're really interested in writing a character that has a specific background or a specific accent or a combination of both, do the work. Just read up on it, listen, find people who have that specific accent, talk to them about it, and use it in a useful way, because that will not only make your game richer, it will also provide a more interesting experience, and you can still use it as a distinction. You can still use distinctive accents, distinctive voices, but just in a slightly more clever way. Last thing I want to give as an example, I mean, there's an example in the image already of one of those accents that has been copied over and over and over again. But think about, for instance, movies that are about World War II. You often have, like, for instance, German officers in there who will speak English, but with a German accent, or a mock German accent, or something that resembles a German accent. And sometimes it's perfect, because obviously there's a lot of dialect coaches and accent coaches who work on that stuff. But then they talk to each other, and that's they talk to each other in English with a German accent as well. which, when you think about it, obviously makes no sense because they would speak German with each other. And the fact that they speak English with each other is fine because it might be an English movie and you don't want to have subtitles all over the place. But does that German accent really add something? And you see the way they look like, you know what they are, and now they talk to each other in English, which is already not authentic. So do you really need them to have that faux accent in there as well? Just something to think about. There are a lot of conventions out there. So again, be creative, do the work, and find ways for you to use accents and dialects in a creative way, in a way that you have researched and decided that makes sense for your game. Okay, so on to the next thing, which is jokes and irony. Totally different thing, but also incredibly important, especially in the written language. And this is something that I personally realized when I started writing for games that had no voice acting, because I wrote some jokes and they just fell flat, basically. Because in voice, you have the timing of a joke. You have the inflections you can do in sentences that help the timing. You have the body language of the actor. You have facial expressions. Everything you need to make that joke work, or make irony work, because that's something that's quite different when you're writing it down as well. Because when you don't have actors and you have just the written words, that's all you have. You have just the written words. Maybe you have a tiny bit of body language and facial expression. For instance, if you're writing for a game that has no voice actors but has elaborate animations, that's great because that's really going to help. But you probably won't have enough animations there to really convey all of the body language and the facial expression that an actor would give. So that means that without the body language, without the timing, jokes can really fall flat. So think about ways to write jokes that work when you read them. And it might mean that one of the jokes that you thought about has to go, or especially irony is incredibly difficult to do. But what I found helps is if you compare your written words to emails, social media, and I named it like other faceless messaging. That also immediately gives you the example of the problem that you have, because I think we've all at one moment or another have written an email or send out a message that somebody else didn't understand or misunderstood. Yeah, we can use emojis, stuff like that, but usually, unless you have like a chat game, which was just discussed, or something like that, you don't have emojis like that. So if you want to do jokes, if you want to do irony, compare it to emails, social media, stuff like that. Do some research and see what works there. Like what sort of jokes work on Twitter. And I mean, not memes or whatever, just written down jokes, word jokes. What sort of irony gets understood by readers? What doesn't? Finding examples, again, I'm probably gonna repeat it often during this talk, but finding examples really helps you to find your own way to write stuff like this. Also, comedy words. Basically, words with a K are comedy words often. Word combinations. there's stuff that works. There's an image down here from a Monty Python sketch, the Woody sketch, it's called, or it's named, which is like this weird sketch about words and how some words sound woody and other words sound tinny, which is quite absurd. But when you see that sketch, you sort of realize that that is definitely how words can work. They have this notion in them, and some words are just funnier than others. Some combination of words are funnier than others. A lot of comedians have talked about this, written about this. So again, if that's something that you want to do and you're interested in, take a deep dive into theories like that, and see what sort of words and word combinations could work for you and the characters that you are writing. Great. And we're continuing to pacing. And by pacing, I obviously mean pacing in the way that your story is told and the way that your dialogues are paced. In general, if you have voice dialogue, you decide, and obviously you can mean you as a writer, the actor, director, the animator, everybody that works on the game, basically. All of you together decide what the pacing is. So how fast will an actor say the next line? Where will the pauses be? At what moment will you have like a meaningful silence, stuff like that. And also overlap is possible. So two actors speaking at the same time, or one actor speaking and then the other one butting in there and just truncating their line of dialogue. That's a richness that you have with actors and with voice dialogue that you don't have with written dialogue. Overlap is not possible. I'm sure there's one or two games that have that, but it's still all going to be quite well, not natural because it's written down. And usually the player decides what the pacing is of the dialogue. And I put there usually between brackets because obviously there's a difference between whether you have like a game that has like the one that you can see there, Hearts, Medicine, Doctor's Oath, has in the right-hand corner says tap to continue. So basically characters will say one line or sometimes two lines if there's two characters, and they appear, and then the player taps, and then you get the next line. That's often what happens. Or you have a specific time between every dialogue line that just continues, so you don't have to tap, but you know, like, oh, I have 10 seconds for this one, and then 10 seconds for the next, and then 10 seconds for the next one. So yeah, it changes between games. All depends on what you're doing, but usually the player will decide what the pacing of your dialogue is. And that's also something that really decides the way that you're writing something. You might not realize it, but it does happen, especially when you look back at things that you have written when they're implemented. I've often had that. I wrote a scene, and then it was implemented, and then I saw what happened when you tap to continue, and then you sort of feel that pacing is off, because that's the first time that you actually realize this is how the player will see those dialogue lines. So if you are writing for a game like that, play it, and you'll probably have to change a bit, or your colleague who does the implementation will see that. For instance, Hearts, Medicine, Doctor's Oath, I worked with a colleague who had like a great eye for that. So he was sort of implementing it, also sort of directing. So eventually he just knew like, okay, I've implemented it and now I'm playing this, and oh, this needs to go and this needs to be different. And which was great because we really worked together to make that happen. But that pacing is really a big important part of it. And to illustrate how that can influence you as a writer, I wanted to show you a fragment from this specific game. So Hearts Medicine Doctor's Oath is a free-to-play game that's on mobile. And it's a game that has chapters. So basically you play a couple of levels and then you get a new scene or sometimes two scenes that unlock, and then you play and continue. It's a hospital story, that's quite clear. And there's no voiced dialogue in there. There's music, but there are no voices. This game was released, I think, a year and a half ago, 2 years. And some fans of the game who are also into professional or semi-professional voice acting wanted to do a voiced version, which is great. I have to check my notes because I wrote down what they were called. Vibrantly Cool Productions. So Vibrantly Cool Productions, if you are tuning in, or if anybody who sees this knows them, you did an awesome job. It's great. Like the voices that you chose and the acting is awesome. But what they did was obviously give a voice to something I wrote for unvoiced. And even though I love their work, when I see how they did it, it really wants me to go back to what I wrote and sort of change it up and give it back to them and say like, oh, do it like this. Because if this would have been voiced, I would have written it completely different. So I want to show you a short scene from this game. And at first I'll show you it without any voices. You can also not hear the music in this instance. Just think about there is music, but just read it and see that scene. And then after that, we'll look at the voiced version, and hopefully you get what I mean by there's a difference in the way you write it. So let's see this one first.
Do you want some more? Allison?
I'm sorry.
I wanted to show you the non-voiced version, and now I'm showing you the voiced one. So let me try that again. Yes. Okay, so that was a non-voiced, and now we'll go to the voiced version.
Do you want some more? Allison?
I'm sorry. It's just...
I get it. It's a struggle to feel welcome in this new hospital. For all of us.
At least you're a licensed doctor. I've never felt more like just an intern. Where are you going?
I thought you could use some cheering up.
World's best doctor.
Well.
Thanks, Daniel. I really needed that.
Hey, we've overcome worse.
Much worse. Like falling off a cliff in an ambulance?
Or performing brain surgery during a fire.
I did like how that ended.
Me too.
Okay, so I hope you got a feel for that difference in pacing. And like I said, I think the actors did great work, and they did like the best thing they could do with this pacing. But looking at this, if I would have written this for a voiced scene, I would definitely have written it different. And obviously also the fact that you have to tap to continue always gives like a pause between some of the lines. And that's also something that you can keep in mind from early on already. As soon as you start designing a game, think about how, if you don't have voice dialogue, how the dialogue will appear on screen and how much you can do. Like, for instance, we can have one or two people talking after each other, but then you really have to do the tap to continue. So that gives you like a pause anyway. And you can use that to really put a bit more pacing in it, the way that you would want to, and sort of guide the player. So think about that as soon as you start designing your game, and that will really help you to pace it the right way. Okay, then we go to tutorials. Tutorials is probably a whole thing in itself to discuss. But I briefly just want to touch upon it. What I often see is that tutorials are sort of a last minute thing, or often like a writer will write dialogues and whatever, and one of the game designers or the programmers will just like the lines for tutorial in there, and then there's no time at the end to sort of make those things fit together. So often a tutorial can feel like something that is separate from the rest of the dialogue in there, which I think is a shame. So again, especially for indie games and small teams, start thinking about the words in the tutorial from the first moment. You can put like temp stuff in there, of course, but it will help the player if it's really part of the whole experience. A lot of this is obviously UX material, but just in general, some experiences that I've had. If you have voice tutorial, it's much easier to make it diegetic, so part of the whole story of the game. It's easier to make fun. But if there's no gameplay of interaction, you still need to repeat words or stuff like that. Because if a player hears something and has to do it immediately, they'll remember it. If they hear it and they don't have to do anything, they just hear it, they will forget it faster. There's been like research about, for instance, like learning. If you have to learn stuff, when you write it down, you remember it easier. this works the same. If you have just a written tutorial, the player will be bored faster, especially if you have a lot of words in there and it's not really incorporated in the gameplay. A player will just click on it and continue because they want to play. So try to keep it short. It's harder to remember relevant details because if the lines are long and there's a lot of info, in general, people won't remember. But the ability to reread stuff or take your own pace in doing it can be really beneficial for players. So both have their pros and their cons. And like I said, a lot of it is UX and a lot of it is dependent on what kind of game you make. But try to think about it from the first moment that you're designing your game and really incorporate it into the writing, and that will make it a lot easier for you. Okay, just a short mention about working with actors. Like I said, there's been some great talks about this already, so I won't go into everything. I just want to have like 2 things to mention here. The first is I put there like clunky lines or hard to act. Players will have different reference points, especially if they're playing a game that is in a language that is not their native language. So for instance, they play in English, but English is not their first language. There can be a lot of debate between players whether actors are actually good actors or if the lines you wrote were really clunky and bad, or if the lines were good, but the actors were really bad. Players will have different reference points. Also, again, going back to that first point I made about speech patterns and stuff like that, you have your own way of speaking and also your own way of listening. So that means when you get criticism like that, try to find the core of the problem. Actors have those speech preferences as well. Like I find often that, for instance, I write a line and then an actor will act it, and they'll, for instance, invert like the verbs in that line just by accident, because that's the way they would say that sentence. So they read it, they act it, and they change it. There's nothing wrong with that. Be flexible about that in general if you, as a writer, are also involved with voice acting. Make sure you give the actors that room, also just to learn from them. If you don't have a lot of experience in writing for actors, it can be incredibly beneficial to see them work with it. And that's why I put here, when in doubt, trust the actor, because it's their job. But stay on top of it, because obviously there's always some stuff in there that is really important to keep as it's written down, or has some special meaning to you or to anybody else in the team. So stay on top of it and make sure that it turns out the way that you want to. But trust the actors in the way that they speak. They have speech preferences. They might have words that they have difficulty speaking. There's this great story about David Tennant, who had to do a BBC nature documentary, and it was a lot about penguins. Turned out he couldn't say the word penguin. So even big actors like that have their speech impediments. So yeah, just work together, and then it will definitely turn out great. But just think about the fact that those different reference points will be there for both the players and the actors, and that's okay. Last point before I get to the final tips and tricks. One thing I haven't discussed here is voice and written text, which means basically you have voiced dialogue, but you also have the text written or optional. Make sure you decide what it is and who it's for. So do you want to have all of the lines that are spoken verbatim? You have to think about that, because if you have subtitles, for instance, like subtitling for TV and film usually condense some of the lines because they're too long to write down. If you need to have it verbatim, think about the space it takes up, stuff like that. Closed captions. So do you have your text written down specifically for people who have hearing impediments? Because if that's what you do, you have to have closed captions, which is different from normal subtitles because it gives more than just a dialogue. It also gives the info on what else you can hear. And the two images you can see are from Old Frequencies, which is a game that's just all audio. The image on the right, you can see, I'll call that the normal image, because that's what you see when you play the game. You always see the text exactly there. But we also have the option to do closed captions for people who want to play the game but have hearing impediments or want to turn off the sound for whatever reason. And that's the image on the left, where you can see exactly the same, but it just says static noise in brackets. There's all sorts of conventions for how you can do this. Something to research if you want to do that. This is really important for making sure that your game is accessible to as many people as possible. It's not that hard to do, but it does take some time to just get into and decide what you want. So think about that. Also think about, is your text going to be optional or not? So can you turn it on and off, or is it always there? Like, for instance, in this game, we had it always there because that's the kind of game that it is. But it also meant that we had to do everything verbatim, because if you hear an actor, you don't see him, but you hear him because this is audio only. So you hear the actor. And the only thing you see are the lines that they say. Every little word in there that they that the actor squeezed in there, that's missing from the text in the image, is going to be weird for players. So that means that you have to put all of those in there as well. So those are the kind of details that you have to think about when you have voice and written text. Again, I've said it before, but something to think about before the last week before your release. Okay, so we're going to the end. Tips and tricks. If you are used to doing voiced games or voiced anything, and you're going to non-voiced, just read comics. That's what helped me, because this is what happened for me. And just the fact that you look at images and have those text balloons and get a sense of how much you can actually say in just one image, how the text and the image work together, and also how it feels for you as a reader to have like lots of text in there, or just a little bit, or maybe not at all. That has really helped me. So if you're somebody who's used to working with actors and is now going to write non-voiced material, just read a lot of comics, and that really definitely helps. Other way around, if you're used to non-voiced and you're going to write for actors, that's also going to need some adjustment. Comparing a book and film adaptation is going to be really interesting for you. Usually people do that for like plot reasons, like what did they keep from the book, what did they take out, what did they change. But there's quite some book adaptation out there that actually use large chunks of the text of the original book. Again, Google it and you'll find some examples, and watch those and try to find out why some of those dialogue lines from the book just immediately work when actors are speaking them, and why other sentences had to be changed. That can be really beneficial. And obviously, read your work aloud. Actually do this always, even if you don't write for voiced dialogue. Reading it aloud always helps. But especially when you are writing something that actors are going to work with. I'm sometimes amazed at how often people don't do this. And it's incredibly beneficial. You don't need specific actors for it. You can just do it with, like have a table read with some colleagues or whatever. Obviously, working with actors is the best, but for starting out, just do it yourself. Use your colleagues. Listen to how they speak your sentences, and don't tell them beforehand how they should do it. Just give them your dialogue and listen while they're reading it, and see like which words they stumble upon, or which sentences they do entirely different from what you wanted. And that really helps your writing. So yeah, do that always. And just to reiterate, be creative. Don't just copy conventions as far as speech patterns, dialects, stuff like that. Put the work in, talk to people, and make sure you listen. Hear how people speak, real people, not just people in film and TV, but real people. And use diverse voices, whether you're casting actors, I mean, especially when you're casting actors, but also if you're writing non-voiced, there is a lot of opportunity to use diverse voices in there as well. So please do that. Think about it, how you can make your characters as diverse as possible, and how you can convey that in their dialogue. Okay, that was the end. And it's time, so I've rambled on enough. Feel free to ask me questions. Also, if you're not watching live, but watching this later, on the NarraScope Discord channel, when that's still running. You can find me on Twitter. You can find my website. Please do reach out, ask me questions, anything you want to know, anything I can help you with. Feel free, and thank you very much for listening.